Hi and welcome to Jessie James Beads. My name is Jem and today we're working with the Magical Mystery Bead Box for July 2025, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Ethereal, beautiful, fae-inspired beads and so much more. Now I had a special request from Kelly and the creative team to create an ear cuff with you. So we're going to work with the King Oberon's bead mix together to create an ear cuff. And here we have the King Oberon ear cuff, fairy-inspired ear decoration from A Midsummer Night's Dream, the July 2025 Magical Mystery Bead Box. First and foremost, when you're making it an ear cuff, you want it to be comfortable. So we're going to take some time and create a basic frame, and then I'll show you how you can add on beads and then you can go crazy with all of the beautiful beads from the Magical Mystery Bead Box. So this is a beautiful collection of colours and we're working today with the King Oberon bead mix. You could, of course, go for the slightly more feminine vibes of the beads that you find in the Queen Titania bead mix, which I used last week to create this pendant. So, of course, you can choose whichever beads you like. In terms of wire today, we're going to be using an 18 to 20 inch length of 18 gauge round wire. This is a medium temper antique bronze colour. I liked how that colour teamed with the blues and greens and natural feel of the colours in the King Oberon bead mix. Now it seems like quite a lot of wire, but you do need that because the wire passes backwards and forwards a couple of times, and this is so that we can generate some strength in the design. Now if you wanted to, you could use a 16 gauge wire, which would give you a little more structural integrity. This has got a bit of spring to it, but the payoff there is that it becomes just that little bit heavier. So I'm going to be working with 18 gauge and it's definitely a great place to start. If you enjoy the process, you can absolutely mess around with the gauge of wire that you use. I'm going to be using my memory wire finishing pliers today in place of round pliers or in place of multi-step bail makers, but you could use those if you wish to. We're going to start off by creating a closed up double spiral with a very small central aperture. So there's a 2mm pin, hello, on those memory wire finishing pliers, and that's where we're going to start. So if I just grip that very end of the wire, spin it around, and what I want is for the tail end of that wire to touch the rest of the wire that comes away in that spiral form. Now you don't have to complete that spiral. Let me just move these beads out of the way for a second. What you can do is get most of the way there and then just continue round. So we're going to go for a double spiral. Now the reason I've gone for a double spiral is that it means you have a nice strong starting place. This is great if you wanted to enhance your design by hanging some chain from this piece, which I may add to one of these designs at the end of today's video. Just a simple jump ring and some chain dropping down from that piece would be lovely. So you've got the strength and structural integrity to do so. I'm just going to borrow my little silicone ear and show you whereabouts this spiral is going to sit. So right now off screen I'm warming my wire through, and this is key to the fluidity of this design. Let's pop those beads back out of the way. Now I would encourage you to fit this to your own ear and then to copy your design when you make the second one, if assuming you want to make a pair. What I'm going to do is to use my thumb to start generating an arc shape in the opposite direction to that spiral. Now the spiral is going to sit down here, just either behind the lobe or just under the lobe. It's absolutely up to you, but this needs to be comfortable and it needs to not put any pressure on the back of the ear here. As a spectacles wearer, if that isn't right, it can really affect your mood. So it does need to be comfortable. Now I don't recommend actually popping this onto your ear and using it as a guide. I recommend creating the form, trying it on for comfort. But what I'm going to do is just allow that to circle round to give you an idea of what it should look like. So we're looking for almost like they used to say over here in the UK, lend us your shell likes. And that was to say, listen to me, please. So it's a little bit like a shell, and I guess that's where that expression comes from. What I'm going to do is to copy the design from the first ear cuff. So let's just pop that spiral down, and that's not a terribly different line, but I'm just going to use this as a guide, and when I get to a certain point in the design, I'll pop it down on the board and then let you just take a second. You can make a sketch or do a screen grab if you want to copy the exact lines. That is quite often the easiest way when you're doing what is essentially a bit of back and forth with that wire. So I've just put a little bit of a bend in to begin with, because what we need to do now is to bring that wire back in the opposite direction to where it was travelling. We don't really want to put too sharp a bend. We want to have a little bit of space in there. So where we're going now, let me just drop this down onto the board in the opposite direction to where I was expecting it to be. Let's pull this to this side a second. So we've got the shape that moves around the back of the ear. We now need to bring the wire up towards the top of the board to create the point of the ear, whether you're going for a Spock or an elf or some other creature of your desire. So that's a little bit too wide. I'm just going to refine that ever so slightly. I don't want it to be a very sharp bend. For one thing, it's nice to have softer bends. We're creating an anatomical design here, and we're not terribly pointy people. So let's pop that down. So you've got that shape there, and again, the 18 gauge is really good. It's just flexible enough. I want to bring that round a little bit more so that it hugs the top of the back of the ear. We're then going to draw this up towards the top of the design to create that pointed elven designed ear tip. So let's just pop that down, pinch to bring that back down to the bottom. Now you can obviously point these ears backwards, forwards, have them very, very sharp, whatever makes your heart happy. We're then going to put a little bit of a smoothness and bring this back down towards that spiral where we first began. It needs to be a little bit wider than it presently is. And there we go. Nice and smooth. And what we're going to do is to bring the wire back up again, almost matching this section that sits behind the ear, but just a tiny bit higher. But the first thing we need to do is to make sure there's space, and then bring that wire back again on itself. Little bit of a pinch. You can use the pliers if you prefer, but like I say, we're going for quite soft turns here. So I'm going to push that wire around to reflect this shape, kind of. And then we're just going to take a second to see how far we've got through that process. So we need to mirror image these. So we've got our spiral going over the back of the ear, up to the tip of the ear, and then we've come back down. And so we need to just take a second to just line them up and make sure that everything is going according to plan. Like I said, when I've got this shape good and sorted, what I'll do is I'll pop it down on the board and you can take a moment to assess that. So this is going to come and sit at the front of the ear. Whoops. They've all joined together to conspire against me. There we go. So it's higher than the starting point. And what we're going to do is to bring that up outside to begin with. And then we're going to fit it just in here. So you don't want this to be too tight because we're going to be using that space in a second. So just bring that all the way around. Now these two need to be relatively close as well. So just one on top of the other, and then bring that wire pinched back up, and now it sits inside the form, heading towards the top, but halfway between those two lines that you can see. What we're going to do then is just trim away that last little section where it crosses over the outside of the ear design. And that's a really handy way to make sure that when you pop this last little spiral in, again I'm using the 2mm side of those memory wire finishing pliers, and I'm just going to spin that around so that we get a neat little spiral. I want the cut end of wire to sit as close to the next piece as possible. Give it a squish. and then take a moment to take stock. So you've got two sections of wire really, but all in one. Now when you're working with something that's going to be worn this close to the body, you can of course add lots and lots of different pieces of wire together to make a design like this. The reason when I create ear cuffs like this for using a single piece of wire is the fewer connections you have, the less likely things are to come apart. So if I pop this down on the board, I just need to cross that over a little bit, like so. That's what we're looking to create. Now this is a double layer in the middle, and you've got a spiral down on one side and a small spiral up at the top there. So if I just open that out gently, and if I just hold it from the corners, you should be able to see how that is created. So I'll just pause for a second there. Lovely. So before you move on to the next stage, if this is your second one, just make sure that they match up. And in terms of handedness, at the moment, it isn't decided. You can very easily, if you need to, switch one through or switch it back. As it happens, the piece with the spiral fits on the inside of the head. So that double spiral fits against the bottom of the inside of the earlobe, and then the larger spiral on the far side is facing outwards. So if you look at it sideways, you should have a mirror image. Two that are the same if you're making a pair, and that's how they will look. So we're currently looking at the side of the ear cuff that sits closest to the head, and what we're going to begin with is adding a little bit of rigidity to the ear tip just here and drawing it together with the front of that beautiful curved pointed ear. So I'm going to be working in 26 gauge wire. This is a medium temper round, and I have an 18-inch length here. Now if you struggle with great big long lengths of wire, you can absolutely use smaller ones. The reason I try to start with an 18-inch length is because that will do probably about half of the work I'm looking to do today. 36 inches in total, but that's quite a lot of wire to handle. So we're going to start slow and try not to stress ourselves out. So what I'm going to do now is to flip to the outside of that ear. You can see we've got this piece towards the top with that spiral on, and we're going to start by weaving around the section just here so that we can tie it together with the outside. What we're looking to do is to bring the pointed front with that cut end together. So I'm going to wrap my wire about 8 times onto that front section, and then I'm going to scooch it all the way down to the bottom. Now it really does pay dividends to make sure that your wrapping when you're doing this is really tidy. Any sticky uppy bits will not be your friend when you're wearing this against your skin, and this will be very, very close indeed. So I've got about 5 wraps there, but I just want to bring that down into its final position. So it's going to sit down here quite close to the front of that ear design. So you can pinch hold of the little spiral you've already got. The wire might rustle on the desktop. So I'm going to add another couple of wraps. There really is no shortcut for this. You can wrap up at the top and scooch it down if you wish to, but do make sure that you're tightening up those coils every single time. So let's get another wrap, I think, just to make that nice and secure. You do want a good starting point, and then scooch all the way down to the base, nice and neat and tidy. If there's still any bags in your wrapping, diagonal pressure from your finer tipped pliers will really help. So what we're going to do now is a little bit of a figure of 8 weave, and if I just open that out for a second again, you'll see that we have got what goes down behind the ear. That was our starting curve where the double spiral at the bottom is. Then we've got 8 wraps on, and I'm going to bring it together with this section where the wire ends. So because the finer gauge wire is coming off the top of my first wire, I'm going to take it underneath my second wire, and I'm going to just do a little open figure of 8 weave to bring those two pieces together. It doesn't need to be super tight, But what I'm going to do is just pinch that for a second and then wrap 3 times around my second piece of heavy wire. So I've got an open section there, which is really nice. And then I'm going to push the leading edge of wire down underneath that outer arc and all the way through. So let's make those nice and tight, 3 little wraps, and then push everything down together. So we're looking to have those quite close together. Again, checking there are no loose bits, no sticky uppy bits. Now I'm going to do an open zigzag weave. It's a figure of 8 weave, and then I'm just going to pinch just like, and already you can see this is starting to come together. So I'm going to wrap 3 times around the outer side of that ear form. That's 1 and 2 and 3. Then I'm going to bring that down but not round again. So tighten those up, and you can see I'm doing a little bit of a diagonal line. Let's get that wire out of the way a second. Tighten up the wraps each time you do those 3, and then I'm going to loop it 3 times around the short spiral section of wire that sits midpoint up that outside of the ear form. 2 and 3, tighten up, and then backwards and forwards until you get to the point just before where that spiral occurs. So what I've done is I've zigged and zagged backwards and forwards, wrapping 3 times on each piece of wire until I'm just below that point at the top. So what I'm going to do here is just wrap 3 times around just before we meet that little spiral. That's 1, that's 2, that's 3. Make sure that that's nice and neat and tidy. And what you need to do now is add on a chosen bead. Now I really like these cloisonné style beads that are teardrop shaped, because it means that what we can do, let's just get that wire into position, is put the wire up through the chubby end and allow that to take us to a natural point at the tip of the ear. Now, as with all of my designs with you, you can absolutely play around with which beads you use, but I just think that looks really delightful. So what I'm going to do now is run around about 8 wraps around the wire down the back of our ear cuff. So that's 1, and I'm just going to be quite firm with this wrapping to make sure it's nice and neat and tidy. If you do find a little bit of a gap before you go too far, address that, otherwise it'll annoy you later. And if you find that you need a little bit more space just to get that tidy, then just make that space happen. So I'm going to continue wrapping about 8 times around here, and then I'll show you how you can add some beads on down the back of the design. So I'm currently looking at the front side of the design, and the way you can tell that is that the double spiral on the lowest point is on the back, and then you've got this plain little channel coming down towards the bottom on the front. So I've wrapped maybe 8 or 10 times just to make sure that that cloisonné bead is nice and secure. And now I'm going to add in one of the floral inspired beads. So I'm going to put the wire through the narrow end of that flower and allow that to whiz all the way down into position. If I just grab the other one, you can see it gives a really pretty view. So what we're going to do is bring the wire from underneath that frame through the bead to over the top of the frame, and it's really easy to just get that to sit because the flowers have got these little gaps in between those petals. So if I push the wire all the way around, we're going to lock that into position by wrapping 3 times around that frame wire, and then bring it back up and through. So if I wanted to match this design, we would go for one of these faceted green beads. However, I'm going to make mine in a slightly different format. So I'm going to show you how to add on some of the different beads. So I'm going to choose one of these faceted beads today. Let's slide that all the way through and see if we can make that sit nicely on the wire. Now you have the option of whether you want it to sit kind of inside the frame or on top of the frame, and with this faceted one I like how it sits on top of that frame. So my finer gauge wire has started underneath the frame, so that means I need to bring that bead across the wire and take the finer gauge wire over the top. So we'll wrap again 3 times. And then I'll continue my way all the way down the back of this ear cuff design adding beads as I go in a random kind of order. So let's just push that wire all the way through, and then you can continue adding whichever bead you like. As you work your way down the back of that ear cuff, what you will find is that at a point your beads will start filling that gap, and that's really lovely to have happen. So the finer gauge wire is coming underneath the outside of that ear back, so I'm going to take it over the top of the opposite side. Just hold that into position, and then we're going to wrap 3 times around the other side of the channel. Now this is a variety of channel setting beads. Normally one would go from the top to the top, but because we're already using a switching design, it pays to just carry on switching from on the top to underneath. Now what we're going to do is go back in the opposite direction, but the wire is now coming underneath the inside of that heavy wire, so we're going to take it over the top of the outside of that wire, but we're going to do so without a bead at all, and that's absolutely fine. It only adds to the strength of the design. Now what you may notice is that we are starting to get short on wire, which is why I've come back to you part the way through the project. I wanted to show you how you can utilise these beautiful daisy spacer beads in this design as well. So let's just slide that one on. I'm going to sit it across the gap, and just make sure that it sits over the top of that pass of wire that didn't have a bead on it. And then you can allow the daisy to sit over both of those pieces of wire. Utilise the gaps between the petals to just sit that, and it will bridge that gap beautifully. So all the way around once, all the way around twice, and all the way around a 3rd time. Now what I'm going to do here is to trim that wire away, because although I might get one more pass of wire out of it, I'd rather have some extra wire and start on the next segment of this project. So what we're going to do is to make sure that we bring that wire to inside the frame, so it sits as far away from the body as possible but isn't visible. So let's trim that wire away, and then what we're going to do is to take the tip of that wire and make sure it's really, really smooth. So let's just, can you see the sticky uppy bit just there? We need to make sure that that is nice and smooth. So it's as far away from the body as possible, but we've also hidden it really nicely underneath that daisy spacer. So to add more detail, all I'm going to do is take another probably 12-inch length of wire just here, and I will start winding on some more beads in exactly the same way as we have done, and then I'll join you back in a second when we get down to the base here. So I've finished adding my King Oberon's bead mix beads to this back section of the ear cuff, and my wire has found its way to the outermost section of that rear wire. I've added 3 little wraps, as I normally would, to that piece of heavier gauge wire, and what we're going to do now is to tie this to those 2 little spirals, or that double spiral, right back at where we started at the beginning. So I'm going to take the wire all the way around the outside of both of those items, and then I'm going to push the wire back up through the hole in the middle of that double spiral and inside that little hairpin down at the bottom of the design. So if I bring that all the way through and just get those to sit one over the top of the other, doesn't matter if it's not exactly the same position as it is on the other ear wrap or the ear cuff. What we're going to do is to wrap 3 times around both the double spiral and that hairpin shape. So that's already gone through once. Bring that up through again. That's the 2nd time, trying to keep those wraps nice and neat. Let's take that through for a 3rd time, and then just give that a tiny bit of a squish, so that what you can do is finish off by wrapping on just that hairpin section down at the base of the ear cuff. So nice and firmly, and then this time, instead of coming through that double spiral aperture, I'm just coming up inside the bottom of that little hairpin bend we created down at the base at the back of the ear. So let's bring that all the way through. Finish off with at least 3 wraps. However, if you have space, a couple more wouldn't go amiss, because it's quite structural, this wrapping. So that was wrapping 3 times to bring the spiral together with the rear of that ear cuff, and then continue a couple more times around that segment. So what we're going to do here is trim that wire away neatly with the cut end as far away from the worn section as humanly possible. So in a few minutes I'm going to add just a handful more beads. I think I managed to fit 3 or 4 just across that section, but what I want to do is to show you how to now make this wearable. So if you very softly, very gently prise that apart, you'll see that you've got the segment that sits over the back of the ear, and then you've got the segment that sits over the front of the ear. So my ear that I have is only a right-hand ear, unfortunately. So let me just bring the ready-made one in and show you. If I pop that on to the ear design, like so, you can see that that single pass of wire, that naked wire, sits comfortably behind the ear, and it just holds everything in position whilst you pop on your King Oberon ear cuffs. Let's take that back off. Another thing that you might like to do is very gently dome outwards. So let me show you what I mean. This is the bit that goes behind the ear. You've got a little bit of separation now. And what we're going to do is to bring the tip slightly closer to the body than the inner section of wire, and it just gives us a little bit of a 3D effect, so that you can see that when that's worn it just slightly sticks out. So you can play around obviously with that design to your heart's content. I'm going to add a handful more beads, and I might put some chain hanging off those spirals down at the bottom. Haven't decided yet, but I'll take a photograph and leave that on the outro screen for you in just a moment. I really hope that you have enjoyed this A Midsummer Night's Dream from the July 2025 Magical Mystery Bead Box. Thanks so much for watching.